Thank you very much, Bessiana. So I will present you today, in fact, two papers that are linking around this idea of financialization Mark I and Mark II. Before going to the detailed presentation, I would just want to stress three stylized facts that can help you understand what I am trying to do. So the first fact is this one. We have this idea of a long slowdown, a long downturn, to use Brenner's terminology, of declining growth decade per decade in high-income economy. And part of the explanation among heterodox economics has been a problem related to investment behavior. And here I just take this slide from Basu and Coates 2017, that the rate of capital accumulation for the non-financial corporate business sector in the US. And you see that decade by decade you have a decline in this rate of accumulation, except with the exception of the late 90s. What is surprising, and we will go back to that, is that this decline of investment is occurring in a context of stable or increasing profits since the mid-80s. So that's also for the US here, and you see that you have a stabilizing tendency since the 80s and even an increase at the end of the period. So it depends on the countries, but at least you don't have a decline in the rate of profit. So that's the basic puzzle that we will discuss. That's the main, I think, one of the main points of the conversation about among heterodox economists, and we will try to find some, to make some hypotheses concerning that. But I had something else in my own research that helped me to formulate some of the hypotheses that I will examine now. Is that I've made some empirical research at the sectoral level. My PhD was about the metallurgical branch in Russia in the 90s, and afterwards I worked on the retail industry. And in particular, in the retail industry, there is this paper that we made with Céline Beau that was mentioned yesterday by Marie. And we saw this phenomenon, and for me that was very striking. That helps me to think about differently about the macro interrogation that we have here. What is this graph? This graph is looking at the fact that retailers are, since the 90s, have improved dramatically their way of dealing with logistics. And because of that, they were able to reduce very importantly their inventories. And in the meantime, they increased their debt to their stockholders. So what that means? That means that during the 90s, retailers were funding the cost of their inventories by their debt to their stakeholders, suppliers, in this case. But more and more, these suppliers are funding freely, giving freely for them capital to these retailers. And this suggests to me that we need, in order to understand profit strategy and possibly some impact at the macro level, in relation to the change in terms of industrial organization in the context of global value chains. So that's the second kind of issue that I will deal in this presentation. So here is my outline. The first paper that I will present is a discussion of the financialization narrative that we usually have. I will explain this profit without accumulation puzzle, and that the fact that it's a long-lasting puzzle, but also that financialization, there has been 4 stories, and each of these stories are not that much consistent or are some shortcomings. And I will try to explain that, in fact, we have one phenomenon that is financialization in the sense of profit without accumulation, but we have 2 regimes in this general phenomenon. That will be my main hypothesis. And the second paper, I will examine one part of this mechanism of financialization, that is intellectual monopoly in globalization. So this is a recent paper with Milberg, working paper, and we will discuss the endogenous asymmetry with intangibles in global value chains and their consequences for uneven distribution of profits within global value chains. So profit without accumulation, a long-lasting puzzle. In fact, that's not really profit without accumulation, but more a relaxation of the relationship between profit and investment. if you look for Germany, France, Japan, UK, and the US, you have a decline from most of the period for some country like the UK or France up to the 2000. In the case of the US, you have a U-curve from 1990 to 2000, and then a decline. In the case of Germany and Japan, that's more consistent decline, but we have less on a more short historical period. But in general, there is this empirical stylized fact, which echo a very important discussion in the literature. It's economical studies. We have one of the pioneering studies, Glynn, Andrew Glynn paper in 1997, that stress the fact there is a losing of the relationship between profits and capital accumulation since the mid-70s. And we have a lot of more heterodox work that we will discuss in this paper. But we have also more recently a mainstream interest in that. For example, there is this paper by Rentiers and Philippon that stress the fact that investment is weak relative to profit and to valuation since the 2000 in the US. And they have a discussion also about Europe. That's one among others. So there is a very important discussion in that. And among heterodox economists, that's anything but trivial, this phenomenon. Indeed, from a classical or Marxist, profitability is the fundamental determinant of the rate of growth of the capital stocks. If you know how to make profit, you go on in the same direction, so you invest more. So that's a puzzle. But in a Kaleskian perspective too, that's a problem, because according to Kaleski, the causality goes the other way around, so that firms cannot increase their profit unless they invest more. So it's also a puzzle in this perspective. So I will present how the profit investment relationship operates over space and time. I will review the relevant literature among heterodox economics, and in particular, my aim is to clarify the debate about along four partially competing stories. We have various kinds of explanation, and I will try to contrast this explanation. And I will discuss their respective logical consistencies and limited compatibility. I will use some stylized facts concerning the 5 biggest high-income economies and non-financial corporations. And what I want to stress is that this is, of course, a limited study in the sense that it's a profit-centered perspective. It's one-sided. I do not consider animal spirit, capacity utilization that are very important determination in the macroeconomic literature, and also the institutional analysis is very poor here. So the first story is the revenge of the rentier. The revenge of the rentier has been developed, for example, by Dumilly and Levy. And one of the phenomena that they stress is the fact that there is a cost of neoliberalism. And the most obvious cost of neoliberalism is, as a macroeconomic level, is its poor performance concerning accumulation, and due to increasing financial payment. And in fact, what they stress is the fact that this accumulation rate is limited because firms are not able to retain enough earnings. There is a disconnection between profit and investment because retained earnings are diminished. And this echo somehow the idea of a new financial norm by Robert Boyer. Robert Boyer stressed the fact that there is a liberalization of finance that increases the profitability of financial operations, raising the general level of return expected by investors. So we have here a kind of connection between the shareholder value and interest rate, high interest rate. And finally, we have also this idea by Lazanik, more business perspective of, and also their paper with Mary in 2001, the idea of retained earnings as the key driver of the development of the managerial enterprises. And so if you don't have retained earnings, managers are not able to invest and to develop. So shareholder value maximization in this sense is to blame for this phenomenon of profit without accumulation. Firms are not able to fund investment in organization, in fixed capital innovation, and so on. So that's a very common story. I think we can summarize the argument like that. We have the 1979 coup, which is in fact the the idea of revenge of the rentier is that this monetary decision to raise, very importantly, the interest rate as a class content is a way for capitalist classes to reassert their hegemony. And the result, of course, is rising interest rate. In the meantime, we have financial liberalization, meaning more new opportunities of financial profit. And between the two, there is a hurdle rate, making the fact that non-financial firms need to be able to serve their investors with the same high level of returns. And so they are asking higher dividend payment. And the result is what? Is a decline in retained earnings, a more important share of earnings distributed to financial market, or through dividends and buybacks, or through interest rate. That's the main explanation of slow accumulation, according to this story. So, what are saying the descriptive statistics? In general, it's okay. It works for all the countries. We have a rise in financial payment in form of interest and dividend by non-financial corporations since the 70s. It's very clear for France. It's clear for the US up to a point, but I will go back to the US case afterwards. And from the mid-80s, we have a similar trend in the UK and in Germany. The Japanese case is very different, but we had this financial crisis in Japan in at the early 90s that may explain this various trajectory. So here, what I want to stress is that we have very different level depending on the countries, but part of that is for reason of accounting. For example, in France, you have social contributions that are included in the cost of labor. So at the macro level, that explains that you have very various level of profit and because of that, of the weight of interest and dividend. Of course, in the case of the US, we have something else. That's the role of buybacks, and we see indeed that in the US there is a tremendous increase of buybacks since the early 90s. We need to look that it's a very specific US story. In other countries, you don't have such an important role of buybacks. And I think it's important to stress that because it shows that buybacks and dividends, in fact, are similar in their function. That's a way to distribute value to shareholders. That's not two different way of valorizing capital. That's mainly for taxation reasons. So, okay, so we have this first story that is very well known, and but we have a second story. And the second story is that non-financial firms are not the victim of financialization. They are not the victim of financialization. They are taking advantage of financialization in order to make financial profit. They are having a new strategy of profitability through financial investment. So the argument go back to Sweezy. You have this idea of a lack of investment option, over-accumulation in Marxist terms. And so financialization is a way to try to solve this lack of investment opportunities. According to Krippner, that has made a very important contribution in this regard, Krippner say that, okay, that's not over-accumulation, that's more a contingent outcomes of inflow of international capital in the US, of some pressure from the population in favor of liberalization of the access to credit to mortgages. So various contingent outcomes, the result of which is the rise of financial channels of accumulation. And so she according to her, financialization is a pattern of accumulation in which profits accrue primarily through financial channels rather than through trade and commodity production. And we have also another argument which is related to the shareholder story, but that say that the main point is that the management is under greater pressure from shareholders, and because of that is more short-termist. And because of that, managers will be reluctant to take risk, and they will be more keen to make investment that do not commit themselves. And financial investment have this nice property that you can, thanks to liquidity of financial market, you can sell your financial assets And so there is less commitment in the future. So that's the third way to explain this financial turn of accumulation. So we have various causal mechanisms, but they all converge in this idea that you have a drive for financial investment instead of real accumulations. So that explains slow accumulation. And in the meantime, thanks to the dynamism of financial sphere, you have financial profits. So that's the second story. Firms are not the victim in terms of financialization. They are taking the opportunity of liberalized finance to make profits through financial channels. So what is the evidence here? We have some evidence of a rising financial income, especially for France. Here it's very clear. In the US, that's also clear, but not that much. That's very clear from the 70s to the early 90s. Even when we had buybacks, that's here, we have some increase, but not tremendous. That's also the case for the UK, but less so for Japan and for Germany. I think there are several problems here. One of the main problems is that you need to, what Krippner doesn't do, is that you need to establish the relationship between these two stories. You cannot have, in the meantime, firms that are making, that are squeezed, retained earnings that are squeezed by finance, and in the meantime, finance that is giving way of firms to make some profit. That's not consistent. And indeed, if you look at the data, if you look at the net financial payment, that means financial payments less financial income of non-financial corporation, you don't have anymore any squeeze of profits by firms. You have a kind of stability in terms of net financial payment. And that's very clear. Even in the case of Japan, we have a significant decline. So that's the first problem is here. There is a second problem. If you look at this year in the US, 2005, there is a peak, a very marked peak in terms of increase in terms of financial income by non-financial corporate firms. And you know what occurred this year? You had a tax holiday by the Bush administration that allowed firms to repatriate their foreign earnings without paying taxes. So this shows that, in fact, when we are looking at financial income at this level of data, that's not really financial income, because that includes incomes from abroad, profits realized abroad. So there is a problem with this narrative of financial accumulation, that a big part of this financial income, in fact, is just profit that was made abroad. So that leads me to move to a third story. And here we are beginning to move to the second financialization Mark II that I will propose later on. That's the globalization story. So here we have the classical argument that international trade should prop up further the accumulation. So that's the argument of Ricardo, that's the argument of Marx, that the global market is a way to alleviate pressure on profitability. One argument is that as soon as you have lower input, cheaper inputs, you will be able to make more profits and then invest more. But there is two possible leaks, and here I am very close to two kinds of literature. One literature stressed that firms could prefer to invest abroad rather than invest domestically. So that's an argument made by Jimmy Levy and Fibiger. And the second argument is the argument made by Milberg that you can indeed increase your profit thanks to cheaper inputs, but you do not necessarily will invest this new profit. You can just distribute them to financial market. So here is the summary of the argument. You had the post-socialist transformation, trade and investment liberalization. So here is the institutional part of the globalization story. The result is that you have a global pool of disposable labor. So that's the grid doubling. According to Freeman, you have a huge quantity of labor available for global capital. And as a result of that, you have two phenomena. On the one hand, you have new investment opportunities for capitalists from the north that could result in terms through FDI loans, export of financial services, and repatriation and and FDI, that will result in repatriation of dividends and other financial income. So that's the profit size. And on the other hand, you have decreasing prices of inputs in global commodity chain. So you have lower prices of input and then higher profit markup. In both of the cases, without the need to make more investment. That's a connection with the story. So we have this first story. So what is the empirical evidence? This graph, of course, is very spectacular. That's the rate of investment, capital formation by a group of countries since the 70s. And you see that since the mid-90s, you have a great divide between developing and high-income economy. You have also the increase of the stock of outward FDI by high-income economies. If you look at FDI income and payments, it's also very clear that all but the UK have a net income from FDI that is positive. So this idea that you are bringing value back from the developing country in the developed one is supported by this kind of empirical statistics. And also you have the rise of imports from emerging and developing countries. That is very spectacular, less so in the Europe because of internal trade, but in all the cases. Okay, my last story is a little bit different. That's the monopolization story. The monopolization story is rooted in a long tradition in the political economy. You have, of course, Smith and the red spirit of monopoly, and the idea that you have deceptive effect of supernormal monolithic profits for non-monopolistic firms and workers. That was pointed out already by Smith, but discussed a lot of since then. You have also this idea of the outcome of competitive struggle. So that's the Marx argument, that you have a kind of dialectic between competition and monopolization. And the battle of competition is fought by the cheapening of commodities. But as a result of this battle, you have monopolization tendencies, the most successful capitals occupying the dominant places. You have the monthly review argument that this causes stagnation. Why this causes stagnation? Because at some point, oligopolistic firms will coordinate their prices, and they will be able to increase their surplus because of this protection from competition. But in the meantime, they will be reluctant to invest in order not to increase too much overcapacity. And okay, here there is a connection with the secular stagnation debate. At some point, Lawrence Summers 2 years ago made exactly this argument. And finally, we have a more recent argument about monopoly, that is the knowledge monopoly capitalism, made by Ugo Pagano, where he put the emphasis on the monopolies of intellectual property rights as a channel through which investment opportunity are reduced. A lot of ideas could not be productively developed because of this intellectual property right. But we will have a more detailed discussion on that later on. What is interesting with this monopolization narrative is that to some extent it is compatible with the other story. We have a price rigidity that protects profit margin, so that's the profit side of the phenomenon. And on the other hand, we have overcapacities that lower incentive to invest. And all these phenomena are compatible with the uselessness of retained earnings. Indeed, if you cannot invest, you can distribute them. Also with the financial term of accumulation, if you do not have opportunity to invest, you will look at other opportunity to invest. With foreign investment, that could be a way not to invest domestically. And finally, with the market power in global value chain. Why? Because in globalization, in order to be able to take advantage of global value chains, you need a market power position. In order to benefit from lower input prices, you need to be able to exert some market power to benefit from these cheaper inputs. So that's interesting. However, there is many critics to this monopolization narrative. First, there are several theoretical flaws. In particular, the idea that you have a secular trend toward monopolization has been challenged by many authors. Of course, Schumpeter, but in the Marxian tradition, Sheikh, both of them stress the fact that you never had a perfect competition. You will always had centralization tendencies and decentralization tendencies. You also have an internal critique by post-Keynesian, and Steindl, Shapiro. Steindl himself say, well, my monopolization story is very consistent at the industry level. But as soon as you move at the inter-industry level, it doesn't work anymore because you have competition. And so my point here is that you have this limitation, but maybe we can limit this argument to some specific circumstances that need to be historically more precisely defined. That's the first problem. So we need to soften this hypothesis of monopolization, to be careful when we use it. The second problem is the problem of periodization, because most of the literature concerning financialization is about a period from the 80s where almost everybody agreed that the main characteristic of the period was more competition and not less competition. You have in particular the argument made by Brenner that the very cause of the long downturn was more competition. You also have in the regulationist perspective the same argument. Mazier made this argument, or Petit also made this argument about the fact that competition was the main feature of the post-Fordist period. We have a shift from the structural form that was the labor market, according to them, in the Fordist period, and in the 80s and 90s, that shift toward competition. So, and indeed, that's very convincing. There are many indications of that. So here we have a problem. But in the meantime, we have new evidence of a new conjuncture at this level concerning the 2000s, since the mid-90s and in the 2000s, in particular in the US. And here I have some interesting style facts. First, that concerns the concentration in US non-manufacturing sector. And you can see that between 1997 and 2012, in almost all the sectors, there has been a significant increase in terms of the market share of the 4 largest firms. So that's a first indication that maybe there is a new conjuncture. You have the same kind of phenomenon, also a little bit less clear in the case of US manufacturing. But I think that there is something interesting and maybe more convincing. Is the role of common ownership, shareholders against firms' profit maximization. The idea that you have some very important investors, like Vanguard Capital, like BlackRock, that have investment that hold position in the various firms in the same sector. And in this case, the objective is not to maximize the profits at the firm level, but at the level of the sector. And it could sound weird, but according to this literature, in particular, Anton has made several papers on that, there are some evidence of that. In particular, they observe a decorrelation between the payment of managers, of CEOs, and the profits of the firms. But they observe a very strong correlation between this payment and the profit at the sectoral level. They have also anecdotal evidence of BlackRock intervening in JetBlue, forbidding them to create a new airline, opening a new line of airline travel in order to reduce competition at this level. And if you look indeed at the share of this investor in the US, that's very impressive. Here you have BlackRock top shareholding by sector in 2013. In all public firms in the US, BlackRock is the first shareholders in 14% of the firms. So that's just huge. And if you look at among the top 10 shareholders, they are among the top 10 shareholders in 65% of US public firms. So indeed, when you look at this kind of number, you can imagine that they can have this kind of strategy. Okay, so that's an indication that maybe there is something to look at in this direction of this transformation in the sense of monopolization through common ownership in the US. Okay, so I will now try to confront a little bit this various argument and move to the second part of my presentation. So in brief, we have some shortcomings in the financialization literature. First, the class monetary perspective of Duminil and Levy seems very convincing if you look at the early 90s, early 80s. This idea of a revenge of the rentiers through increased interest rate. And indeed, this forced restructuration of the US. Very unionized firms became the more important victim of this restructuration of the US firms, but also in other countries you have this diffusion of high interest rate and restructuration dynamics. However, since right now almost 20 years, we have very low interest rate. And we cannot make anymore this argument of high interest rate being the main venue through which there is a squeeze of retained earnings. Moreover, as I have shown, there is this problem of this idea of a squeeze of retained earnings is challenged by the fact that there are other sources of incomes for non-financial firms, financial incomes and incomes from abroad. Second, we have this problem of the financial turn story. I mentioned this, the idea that it's in part a statistical artifact, the fact that we are counting at this level profits from abroad as financial income. That is not, in fact. And we have more theoretical problem. How can financial accumulation by non-financial corporation sustain profit over the long period while there is recurring instability of financial capital, crisis? And also we have this problem of the shareholder value perspective, how to explain the resilience of the downsize and distribute only by themselves. For example, there is the case of Amazon. Amazon, shareholders in Amazon are very happy not to receive dividends and just to invest more. Why? Because for shareholders, if they receive dividends or if the prices of their stocks increase because the firm is making good investment, that's the same. That's just another way for them to give them back their money. Distributing money to shareholders is not the only way to make shareholders happy. Shareholders are happy with good investment that increase the value of your stocks. And Amazon in this story. So there is also here, there is this kind of problem. So monopoly and globalization could be interesting in order to highlight this difference. So I would like to stress this idea that we have two moments in financialization. We have a first period that will be the 1980-95, and a new period from the 2000s. In the first period, what I propose to call financialization Mark I, we have this high level of interest rate that indeed open a new opportunity for financial income. And in the meantime, we also have a restructuration of the economy. So that's the monetary class perspective of Duminil and Levy and others. And I think it's convincing for this first period. But in the second period, we have a different story. At this moment, we have a kind of resilience of this new power structure in favor of shareholders, but we cannot explain by interest rate these dynamics. And we need to move to other phenomena. So the other phenomena are globalization with market power in global value chains, which is consistent with farming of investment opportunities, and monopolization, as I explained, that could connect all of this story. So I propose, and this is not in the paper, that's more an hypothesis in progress, that in fact we have two stages of financialization, what I propose to call financialization Mark I and financialization Mark II. Both of them are common characteristics in terms of low investment, high distributed profit, high financial income, and stagnant wages. But interest rate in the case of financialization Mark I is high and financialization Mark II is low, so that's the first difference. And also we have two different international regime. We have higher competition in financialization Mark I, so competition as the main feature of this period, while in the second period we have intellectual monopoly in global value chains as the main feature. because of that, we have two kind of dynamics. In this case, the dominant forces is restructuration, which in many cases means a great defeat of labor, the defeat of labor, the massive layoffs, and so on. While in the second period, what could be the main driver is more predation, so uneven exchange, in particular in the international trade. Okay. So I propose to dig a little bit more in this direction with this second paper that we just uploaded with Will Milberg from the New School, and which title is Intellectual Monopoly in Global Value Chains. So what we are looking at here, we are looking at this idea of intellectual monopoly in globalization. We had an initial multilateral push by the WTO, that's the TRIPS agreement, in order to have stricter intellectual property rights. But also we have increasing provision concerning intellectual property rights in preferential trade agreements. So Luis Pinto will talk about that later on today, so I will not go into too much details. But also we have another dimension, that is the role of intangible in global value chains. And in fact, we have some recent paper by Timmers that stress the fact that there seems to be a link between the ability of firms to capture value in global value chains and their intangible intensity. So we will look at this phenomenon too, and the objective is to discuss the impact of development prospect. So there is the north-south discussion of value capture and uneven geographical development, but also, and here is the connection with my previous talk, is the pressure to reinvest, the softer pressure to reinvest profit in the north. That's the financialization and stagnation narrative that I was discussing previously. So first, I will discuss this idea of endogenous asymmetries of market structure with intangible in global value chains. Then I will explore the connection between global value chain, the expansion of global value chain and stricter intellectual property rights. Then I will move to network complementarities and scalability of intangibles. So that's more the idea of natural monopoly dynamics linked to intangibles. And then present some brief element of discussion. So, first of all, I will just make a few conceptual clarification. The first concern intangible assets. Intangibles are non-financial assets, so that lack physical substance, are non-rival, and are at least partially appropriable. We can also stress the fact that thanks to the development of ICT, information and telecommunication technologies, these assets show their non-rival potentiality and scalability fully realized. There were always intangible assets, but they were in some sense restrained by the lack of possibility to scale them and to be really used at different level in the meantime. Intellectual property rights, so they contradict the non-rivalry of intangible assets by restricting their uses. That's copyrights, that's patents, and so that's all of kind of intellectual property that are managed within the World Intellectual Property Organization. Interestingly, not all intangibles are protected by intellectual property rights. There are some intangibles that were not codified, that are not restrained by intellectual property rights. Finally, the idea of intellectual monopoly, it refers to the power of producer of ID to control how their products are used. So the first way to deal with intellectual property rights, with intellectual monopoly, is intellectual property rights. Intellectual property rights are intellectual monopoly. They restrict the uses of ID. And according to Pagano, this is very important because the scale of this limitation is much wider than the scale of the limitation of physical assets. When you own an asset and you own a monopoly on this asset, that's restricted to a specific place, while IDs could be used everywhere. So when you have a monopoly on ideas, you have a global impact immediately. But here is the innovation of this paper, is that we also stress the fact that there are natural monopoly dynamics related to intangible assets in terms of scale economies, sunk cost, and network complementarities. Okay. So intangibles in global value chains. We have this argument by Baldwin that globalization and global value chains is in fact a second unbuilding. The first was the separation between production and consumption, but this time we have a relaxation of the communication constraint, and as a result, a dispersion of the productive process. And this phenomenon of unbuilding challenges the integrity of the labor process. The labor process is dispersed, and there is a kind of decoupling of task, and this decoupling of task creates a need for coordination. And this coordination is realized through information system. So the crucial argument here is that in order to sustain the unbuilding, the globalization of the fragmentation of productive processes, in the meantime, you have a new layer of integration through information systems. Indeed, you have a growing flow of workflow complexity, and for example, labor sociologists are looking through the fact that more and more procedures are precisely described in order to allow this compatibility of labor processes. And also, you have a dense circulation of intangible specification, standards know that all the workflow that is, for example, formalized through various information systems. So we have here twin intellectual monopoly forces. Intellectual property rights that are related to this intangible circulating, but also monopoly forces related to these dynamics of intangibles. And the result of that is that we have a new interpretation of the uneven relationship within global value chains. The standard story is the global competition story. We usually stress the fact that in global value chain, there has been a squeeze of the production level due to a huge amount of workforce arriving on the global market. And that's indeed a very important phenomenon. But what we are looking here is that there is another dimension. There is an intellectual monopoly dimension that allows to concentrate value at the first stage and at the final stages of production. R&D design on the one hand, marketing after sales is on the other end. Because both of these sectors are very intensive in intangibles. So in order to make this argument, we have several things need to be explained. First, there is a coincidence between the expansion of global value chains, so that's some usual metrics concerning global value chains in terms of foreign value added in exports that increased since the 2000s, and so it depends if we have data at the sector level or at the national level, but from the mid-90s we had a general trend, increasing trend in terms of fragmentation. And in the meantime, we had a very important push in favor of global intellectual property rights. So I will not detail that because that will be discussed very much by Luis later on, but just let me stress this, is the fact that we have more and more preferential trade agreement. But what is also striking is that since the early 90s, in fact, since the NAFTA, almost all new preferential trade agreements include intellectual property rights provision. So that's become really embedded in the Organization of International Trade. So I don't discuss that because that's exactly what is in the presentation of Luis. I did not know that ahead. But the theoretical argument here is that there is a connection between this globalization, this fragmentation of global value chains and intellectual property rights. Why? Because in global value chains, you have a fragmentation of productive processes. That means that you need to allow intangible to circulate. You cannot make these diverse labor processes coherent if there is no circulation of intangibles in terms of specification, information system, and so on. But because of that, there is a risk of IP appropriation, and firms will be reluctant to fragment the labor processes if they are not able to protect their intellectual property. And this is the reason why intellectual property rights induce to deepen trade fragmentation. Firms will be more confident to fragment their productive processes if they think that their intellectual property is protected. But we also have the contrary dynamics. Firms are pushing for intellectual property rights in order to take advantage of the possibility of fragmentation. In brief, there is a complementarity between fragmentation and protection of intellectual property rights. Here we have the second argument about intellectual monopoly related to network dynamics and increasing returns on intangible. We have here three phenomena. The first phenomenon is that the integrator, the firm that organizes the value chains, is in position to reap the benefit of organizing this fragmentation. That's what I call the gatekeeping advantages. Global value chains is a story of deepening integration. And if you look at the materiality of that, there are several phenomena. First, you have an exchange of inventories and sales data along the supply chain. Then you have fabless manufacturing, like Apple, for example. Apple is a very, it's an industrial company. It controls all the detail of the production process. Even it controls the details of the machinery used to make all the components of his product, but it doesn't own anymore any factory. It sold the last factory in the early 2000s. So it doesn't own any factory. However, this enterprise is organizing the compatibility of all the productive processes. And more recently, we have a new push, further integration through Industrial Internet Consortium in the US and Industry 4.0 in Europe, that the aim of which is to have a more holistic real-time management of the entire ecosystem of products, from the very raw materials to consumers. So in all these cases, we saw that we have a growing importance of information systems in the coordination of unbundled activities. This nurtures natural monopoly forces. Why? Because you have sunk cost, scale economies, and network complementarities with this kind of assets. And these three phenomena, scale economy, sunk costs, and network complementarity, are the very definition, the very causes of natural monopoly dynamics. And this allows lead firms to control access to GVCs. All the firms are interested to participate in GVCs. Why? Because GVC is a way to make complementarity activity compatible and to benefit from the complementarity between the different actors. But the person that is organizing this complementarity is in position to impose a tax and entry prices to this mutual gains from cooperation. So that's the first argument. You have gatekeeping in global value chains. The integrator is able to organize the cooperation, but because he's able to organize the cooperation, he's able to take a higher share of the mutual gains from cooperation. The second argument is an argument concerning innovation, the innovation advantage of the data. If you are organizing the cooperation, if you are organizing this complementarity between the various actors, if you are providing the information system, you are also gathering the data. And firms are very aware of that. Take, for example, Siemens. Siemens, that is the main industrial corporation in Europe right now. What they explain that they manufacture products, but that these products generate a lot of data. And that they are treating this data as a key factor because that's the holy grail of innovation. That's the argument of Kaiser, the CEO of Siemens. So we see here that the integrator in global value chains is also the firm that is able to concentrate the data and then to be able to innovate more. The third argument is a very kind of neo-Ricardian argument in terms of uneven return to scale. For example, you have a battle between Walmart and Amazon. Why do you have a battle between Walmart and Amazon? Because both of these firms are trying to scale up their advantages, their investments in terms of internet infrastructures and in terms of management of supply chains, both of which are intangibles kind of investment. But if these firms are competing for this return to scales, they are in the global chains, there are other firms that are not intangible intensive, that are tangible intensive. And these firms have very different returns. Try to imagine a highly intensive firm and a not highly intensive firm cooperating. As soon as their activity expands, their common output expand, we don't have the same cost structure at all. In one case, the total cost is in the intangible intensive sector augments only very slowly, while in the tangible intensive sector, there is a much more rapid increase of the cost. There are various cost dynamics. In the intangible intensive sectors, the scale economies are much more important than in the tangible extensive sector. So here you have a kind of Ricardian dynamics. You have a differential rent dynamics. If their output are linked together, the returns will be highly unevenly distributed. So this led us to propose this taxonomy of rents related to intangible assets in global value chains. We have, in fact, 4 kinds of rents in global value chains. The first is the intellectual property rents. So there is no complexity here. It's rationing via exclusive right and product production, and the main example in patents. The second kind of rent is what we call natural monopoly rent. It's this idea of a toll on global value chain integration. The provider of integration services is able to take a toll to capture a bigger share than its own contribution to the cooperation of the various actors. So here the example is Apple supply chain management. Apple is able to constrain, and if you look at the business literature in case studies, you have a lot of examples of Apple going very deep into the detail of its subcontractors, asking about their cost and interfering in their operative decision. But in the meantime, it doesn't own any of these assets. Then you have the dynamic innovation rent. So here is a kind of Schumpeter Mark II via data collection. So the monopolists are able to accumulate data, accumulate capacity to innovate. And here, in terms of example, Walmart retailing software was one of the first and more powerful software in terms of supply chain management and gives them a competitive edge for decades. But we also have Siemens example of sensors that I mentioned previously. And finally, you have this idea of intangible differential rent, uneven return to scales within global value chains. Intangible intensive sectors have higher return to scales than tangible intensive sectors. So when their output expands, they will be able to capture a more important share of the gains. Okay, so I'm moving toward my conclusion, and I want to bring some elements of discussion here. So we already have a public discussion about intellectual monopoly and intellectual property rights for about 2 decades at least, since the debate surrounding the TRIPS. But maybe we do not have understood the full story concerning intellectual monopoly. There is not only the intellectual property rights story, which is a very important story, but there is also another story that is related to the dynamic inherent to intangibles. And that's what we will try to bring with this story. The second an important idea that I would like to bring is that we have a connection with the financial story that I mentioned previously. Intellectual profit with investment for intangible intensive segments could be a new way to understand the contemporary ability of firms to make profits without investing that much. That's what I called previously Financialization Mark II. And of course, there is a connection with the development agenda. Intellectual monopoly is a way to limit the ability to develop for a southern country. The first thing, of course, is intellectual property rights, but also the lack of market power limits the ability to capture value and to make investment. Concerning the financialization story, we are beginning an empirical work with Tristan Auvray and Joel Rabinovich. And here is what we are trying to test using firm level data. The idea is that intangible intensive firms will be able to capture more value. Because of that, they will have less incentive to make capital expenditure. They will be able to make more profit and to increase their payout to investors. But in the meantime, they will have to make more intangible investment to preserve their position. So in this case, we can have a financialization story that is still profit without accumulation, but in the details, that's not without accumulation in general. That's with more intangible investment, but with less capital expenditure. And the overall will be negative in terms of growth dynamics as soon as we have more a diminution of capital expenditure that is more important than the increase of investment in intangibles. So we have some preliminary result, encouraging preliminary result, but that's encouraging. Still working on it. Concerning the development agenda, of course, we also use this data of CompuStat, and there is a very important gap between developing and developed countries. So if the dynamic that I suggest is that important, that's a very important issue for developing countries. So both in the rest of the world and in advanced economies, you have an increase in terms of intangible assets over tangible assets, but there is an important gap between these two groups of countries. Some policy implications. So the first is not really new, is that liberalization in terms of trade agreement is a misnomer. We don't have free trade. We have more and more trade that is rigged in favor of transnational corporation, and one of the important examples of that is the role of intellectual property rights. This has crucial implications for global value chain dynamics. We have also decided that the privatization of ID is adverse to development, but the point here is that it's not only an issue concerning intellectual property rights. It's also an issue concerning network externalities and complementarities. We have an issue of natural monopoly dynamics. And as everybody knows, natural monopoly, if you deal with the problem of natural monopoly, the solution is not to increase competition. It's to regulate the natural monopoly. And I think that part of the discussion, current discussion about intellectual monopolies, the role of internet companies and so on, is not so much in terms of competition policy, but in terms of regulation policies. And that's important in particular as far as we were concerned in terms of upgrading possibility in global value chains, without considering these asymmetries of market structure linked to intangibles. Prospects for developing countries to benefit from trade integration are very limited. Thank you very much for your attention.
Property has a great risk of not having their profits back because they can eat, I think, every firm. So the exceptions are even view, I think that you have actually accumulation like in Microsoft. When they produce a software, they are producing surplus value, like a firm that produces shares, for example. In the same way, but what they get from producing software doesn't depend anymore on the socially necessary labor time to reproduce their asset, because they need to produce only one Windows 10 and then rent. They use value for everybody, and then a lot of people pay back their investment, but it's difficult to measure in labor time. So I see accumulation in those sectors. I would like to know your point of view about this.
Thank you. Concerning the first point, the emphasis, I use here the concept of intellectual monopoly in the context of global value chains. And that's very important because the natural monopoly dynamics, that emphasis is within a value chain, is the role of the integrator of the value chain. Our point, the point that we make is that, in fact, there is an infrastructure in order to allow value chains to be organized. And in fact, you had this argument by Aglietta. Aglietta made this argument about subcontracting networks in his book. He explained that when you look at subcontractors, it seems like independent capitals formally, but in reality, that's not independent capitals. They are coordinated by, they are dependent from one main capital that organizes the labor process. And our argument is that this is gaining even more force with this process of fragmentation, international fragmentation of productive processes, but that the support for this are international information system. And these information systems, these are the natural monopoly part of the story. Because in order to, when you are at the level of global value chain, you only have one integrator. Because there's sunk cost, you explained that there are very important sunk costs in making the investment in order to organize the supply chain. And in fact, accountants are valorizing that a lot. For example, in the case of Apple, Walmart, Amazon, and so on, their relationship with their supply base is part of their ability to manage that, is part of their asset. The second thing is that, so you have sunk cost. The second thing is that you have also scales economy dynamics here. Because the more you expand, you do not need to make a lot of investment in terms of new information systems. You need to improve that, but you can scale it. So this combination of scalability and sunk cost are the main justification for natural monopoly, the use of natural monopoly terms in this context. And the second question was more about value, so that's scalability. That's this idea that in the case of Microsoft, you are making some investment at the beginning and producing wealth, but there is another dimension that is the wealth captured through the sales and the valorization of the software. And so you stress the problem. I think that's very interesting to show that there is this predatory dimension or transfer dimension that is very important in the valorization of intangible assets. I agree on that.
So my question relates to the concept of rents, because you're using your taxonomy of rent, and I guess my question comes from me struggling with finding a useful definition of what rents are, and I'm wondering what definition you use.
The definition of rents here is linked to a disconnection between the investment made and the income obtained through this investment. So in case of legal IP rent, natural monopoly rent, dynamic innovation rent, intangible differential rent, in all of these cases, you don't have a direct link between the investment made and the income that you will obtain. That's the reason why I make this use.
So then rent would be income gained that is unconnected
not correlated, connected but not correlated. So there is not a correlation between the investment and
I'm just wondering how generalizable this argument is. You might. Sorry, I'm still. So my understanding is that within these kind of different global value, within different industries, global value chains have different power structures. So my own kind of experiences with the kind of clothing retail thing, which is very much as you described, this monopoly kind of in the north. But I'm thinking about, I think it's Gary's reference work, and he argues that actually this is not the same across all industries. And I wondered how that affects your kind of argument about natural monopoly.
yeah, in fact, our intuition is that in order to move, to map the various structure of global value chains, our proposal is to look at the intangible intensity of the various segments. So the idea is that in order to look where the power is in a global value chain, it's not necessarily one firm, that could be various firms, but our hypothesis is that the intangible intensity will help you to identify where is the market power. That's intuition. So you can observe some value chains where there is various, a more wide distribution of market power, while in other one you have a very concentrated market power. That would be, the suggestion. Yeah.
I have a question there's probably not a lot of empirical information on, but I'm wondering if you have a view. And that's about the possibility of distributed apps or other blockchain technologies to transform the global value chains where, say, the integrator or where the intangibles sit with an open source algorithm rather than with this sort of single firm.
I'm looking for information on that, exactly. I began the discussion with some colleagues from the UK but I'm just opening the subject. I think it's very interesting because indeed, if you have a kind of transparency of this integration process, that changes the whole dynamic within the chain. You're perfectly right. But just, I know that the discussion is beginning, but I have no empirical, I did not have read any empirical case. No, so. Yeah.
Part of the presentation. So when you set up this exercise where you go through 4 different arguments, you pose the puzzle as this really, the way it's posed in literature, as this puzzle of rising profits or stable profits and declining accumulation. And I suppose the question that I had, which perhaps will surprise you, is what's the appropriate level of analysis at which to look at that relationship? And it seems to me that even among post-Keynesians, there's some differences in that regard. Looking at the aggregate relationships, at least, is certainly substantially affected by composition effects. So the shift in what we're measuring in the corporate sector, not least in terms of sectoral shifts. But my real question is, to what extent do we see a breakdown in the profit accumulation relationship if we look at the level, more fine-grained level of detail? And I actually asked the question because I haven't yet worked through the answer sufficiently.
Well, that's absolutely key. So the intuition, that's also the connection that we are trying to make in this paper with Tristan and Joel, because we are looking at firm data. And here what we are expecting, there is already some studies in the US that you have a greater polarization between firms. So you can have a high concentration of profits and even high investment in some sectors and lower profits and low investment in others. But so that's the reason why we make this hypothesis that we can have still financialization if we have more important diminution of capex than the increase of intangible assets. But of course, that will not be the same in all firms. So I think that for me, that was important to move from the sectoral level, where I begin the discussion, to the macro level to try to enter in discussion with the various protagonists in that. But what we're trying to do right now is go back with 2 work, this work and the other work that I mentioned yesterday about Amazon, Walmart, that we want to compare. So back to sectoral level. So in other words, the succinct answer will be probably what we expect is that we have a very important concentration of profits in some firms where we have important level of investment but less important than their increase in profit. And in the meantime, you have less profit and less investment in the rest of the economy. You have a kind of concentration of profits and a lesser concentration of investment. But the overall dynamics is still financialization. So maybe a short way to make the argument would be financialization with concentration in the terms of concentration of profits and of economic power. But I think that's very, so we have these two strategies. I think also that could be interesting to look at the sectoral level, intersectoral diversity, but I'm not convinced that much that it's here the key. I think that in each sector, you have more concentration.
No,
Rather than,
I agree with
yeah.
that. Though I think the figures you put up for the manufacturing industries
Yes.
are much less convincing in that regard. I mean, the dramatic changes in concentration, if you go to the first chart on concentration.
Yes, you're right.
Right? I mean, there are four.
Yes. So that's manufacturing, and that's not very convincing. But
it's also a very short time period, right? So it's.
yes, 15 years.
But even so, it's, you know, if I look at that, where's the average for
I don't have the average for this one, but here is the average.
Yeah, so that's very clear, right? Especially for transport and logistics information.
Yeah. Yeah, but when you think about the weight of manufacturing in the US economy, that's still meaningful.
Well, no, I'm
Yeah.
not saying it's not
Yeah.
important. I'm
Yeah.
just saying, where is the puzzle located? And the first puzzle you started with was the investment, the accumulation profit
Yes.
puzzle. And so my first question is kind of a data puzzle. If you
Yeah.
go deeper into the data, how big is the puzzle? Which industries do we see this playing out, this strained relationship? Because I'm not sure the puzzle is as widespread, and the aggregate suggests that this is a structural puzzle.
Yes.
And I think if you dig into the heterogeneous data,
You
you
see,
see that there are very high profit rates and high investment rates in certain sectors, industries.
and so that you don't have the puzzle at the industry level.
That's the question.
So we know that at the level of the retail sector, where we made this investigation, we have this kind of puzzle. And there have been other case studies, General Electric and so on, that show that there is this puzzle at the sector level. But I agree with you. We need to dig more and to check that. That was the case 10 years from now. Is it still the case? I agree with you. I agree with you. We checked, we did that with Tristan at the firm level. And at the firm level, what we obtained using Compustat data is that we still have this puzzle of more profits and less investment over 20 years at the firm level for the US and Europe. So using firm level data, we still have this puzzle. But sectoral data, no. We did not make it. Yeah. Yes.
So especially in your Financialization Mark II period.
Yes.
Especially in the global oligopolistic players specialized in intellectual property rights and so on. They have accumulated immense amount of cash-like instruments. And I didn't see that in your presentation or in your model because here you have profits and payouts. But these are profits that are not being paid up.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you have analysis of that, or if this plays any significant role in this.
In fact, there is two elements here. The first is that's not inconsistent. You can have high payouts. If you have very high profit, you can have both. The second element is that, in fact, we mentioned that indirectly when we compare financial payment and financial income. Because financial income, that's specifically where I make the case that there is no evidence of a squeeze of retained earnings, because firms are able to have more financial operation. So here.
Yeah. Although most of these cash pools are in called cash pools, because they are in cash-like instruments, which pay very little. It's mostly to save the value over time. They do not generate.
Yeah,
so
I
don't see. I don't know if you see that.
No, we didn't explore that in this data because we don't have this data at the macro level. But I agree with you that it's very relevant. But it's completely consistent with the general story, with the idea that you have a lot of an ability to generate huge amount of profits and a lack of opportunity of or will or whatever to make investment. And this is even making the argument even stronger, this evolution in the recent period.
But it might be inconsistent with the first story, right? The idea that there is this squeeze from the financiers or the managers.
No, not at all. On the contrary.
If they could, if you say, like Lazine says, that the managers are forced to disgorge all the profits, and they don't do that, then really, of course, they do pay a lot, but they could pay a lot more.
Yeah, okay, I agree with you. So we agree on that. That's a limit to the squeeze of retained earning stories, and I think that this story is not relevant. I think that we cannot explain. We had this debate in France with Cordonnier, for example, about this idea of the cost of capital, and basically he's making the argument that if there is not enough investment and not enough employment, it's because capitalists are taking too much money and are not investing. But what we see is that in fact firms, if they will be able to invest more. And they do not invest more. Why? Here there are several arguments. One of the arguments that was made by Boyer that is very important is that investment do not offer enough returns. So there are not enough opportunity of highly profitable investment. And here I think lays a more interesting story. So here you have, in the policy discussion, there are several stuff. You can constrain investment, you can tax non-reinvested profit, you can, but that's another discussion.
Along those lines, I was wondering if you have any thoughts on potential crisis implications of this idea of value coming from returns from intangible assets. Because it seems to me a lot of the rents you're describing have natural limits. And the Walmart example is particularly salient in this effect because there's a physical limit to how quickly you can go through inventory. Likewise, there's a limit to how much an online commerce platform can know about our revealed preferences, and it seems like we're sort of approaching that limit where all our behavior is already known, and there's a limit to how much informational rents can be going from that. What happens when the returns from these intangibles start to dwindle? And does that happen?
In fact, I think there is two kind of discussion here. There is a conjunctural discussion, and that's what you are stressing, and I have nothing specific to add. There are some limits of the prospect in terms of productivity gains related to that. But there is another discussion that is, there is a contradiction right now in the way this potentiality of organization is limited by intellectual property rights and by monopolization in face of how it could be useful for the community. So I think that's more a kind of productive forces, relation of productions, contradiction argument than a conjunctural argument. So there is a stagnationist argument, I think that you made, and I would agree to go in this direction, but there is a more structural argument about the relationship between technology and the way it is organized.
Sketching of what you say, because we see there's a limit to information Amazon can have, maybe, but there's no limit to what they can sell you with this information. So for instance, you see that they got into health, I mean, they want millions of went into health things with like JP Morgan and so on. So there's a limit to information, there's no limit to what they can do with this kind of information. So it's not just like about the quantity of information.
Well, but theoretically, the value they're producing to shareholders, I mean, as you noted, Amazon is sort of sui generis in that, like, they're not actually distributing much value in stock buybacks or dividends. But theoretically, the increase is that we can sell you new and more innovative kinds of products because we know an increasing amount about you. And if you just reach a point of saturation where all of your goods are bought on Amazon, but at the lowest possible prices because they still have to be price competitive, then you no longer have returns to scale of these intangible assets. They're just consistently selling you everything.
But actually, where they make the most money
data storage.
And where you really have the scale, and also because maybe that's why some firms they have less capex because maybe I don't know, when they do the investment in their own IT system, they will buy a subscription as a software as a service to Amazon Web Services. So maybe I don't know how big it is, but it's kind of this game to like it's kind of Amazon tax on the digital economy because anyone who wants to create a startup or grow a bigger firm will have a subscription to Amazon Web Services, so they have a stake in all
the businesses.
Yes.
What's the investment profit ratio for Amazon? Profits are not high.
No, their profits are not high. They are just beginning to make profits. So 3 years from now, they were not distributing at all. But I don't have the number. I cannot tell you for sure. But it's low. But what is very impressive is that they are not distributing. That's the main factor. That capitalists can be happy with obtaining stocks without receiving dividends. And so I think that's also part of, that's an indication that the financialization story cannot be limited to the payout story.
So that's one way of thinking about it. Another way of
Yeah.
thinking about it is that financial investors are playing an end game with Amazon. They're transforming the retail industry by subsidizing Amazon to drive everybody else out of the industry. I mean, if you look at the amount of cash that company has, so the purchase of Whole Foods is an example of this. So they have enough cash, they don't pay out. It's the opposite, they're being subsidized usually by Wall Street. And they're functioning with 2%, 3% return on assets now, which is the highest they've ever achieved. And the bet is they'll transform the retail industry, which they couldn't do if they have to be a viable economic model without financialization. So I'm not sure that
But the capitalists are buying this.
It's not that they're buying it, they're driving it. Right? So they're sitting there and saying, we're happy with this. They're ensuring that the future
they're
will
ensuring.
look the way
You're
they
right.
want it to
You're
look.
right.
Or at least that's their game.
No, you're right. That's a good way to phrase it. But that's a different strategy than obtaining payout. So that's what's interesting in the financial story. That the financial community can make a productive or a developmental commitment in one direction.
Yeah, I mean, I think if I'm interpreting this correct, this is Hilferding to the nth degree.
Yeah, exactly. You're right.
You mentioned at the beginning, like this apparent contradiction between the classical and the more theoretical or Keynesian vision about the relation between profit and investment. And it seems to me like an expression of this old story always about how to link different levels of analysis. And in this discussion about financialization, it seems to me that often there appears things that intuitively, arguments that sounds like, to me, as a fallacy of composition, that we analyze some behavior like payouts of or stock market buyback, and then we said it's story finished, and we don't follow what happened with this payback through the generalized system. So I'm asking, I would like to know from you what kind of strategies can we develop to have this analysis moving from these different, even sometimes apparently completely contradictory causality explanation on different levels, and so we would not get stuck on these fallacies of composition when we analyze, for example, some more specific cases that are very relevant, but at the same time, what kind of strategy could you like this?
I think that you are making the case, and Mary just made the case previously, on the fact that you cannot have a serious discussion about financialization without looking at different levels, because you have composition effect that, as you just mentioned, and between firms and between sectors. Still, it's important to look at the macro level, because at the macro level you have these specific macroeconomic dynamics in terms of growth, investment, and so on. So I think there is a relevance of the macro level that is specific to the macro level, but you need to make a sectoral and case studies in order to allow for the complexity of this various level.
For example, do you think it would be helpful to stuck on the more traditional Marxian distinction, like who is producing surplus value and who is appropriating, and then you don't ask whether the firm is appropriating its own produce, but you
No.
try to like maintain this division, or
No, I think that
kind of, you know,
Yeah,
heuristic rules?
I think that it's very relevant to do that. But the problem that we have is that we cannot make good economics with the theory of value. So we cannot measure exactly where value is produced and say here it is produced and here it is appropriated. That's not there is no way to measure it, as far as I know, that is satisfying. So if you want to look at this question, you need to look at the asymmetry of ability to capture value between sectors. And that's why I look at this mechanism, these value cans of rents, because I can be able to say here there are appropriated value and here there are not appropriated value without mobilizing an empirical evaluation of value. That's more the building of market power that I'm looking at. So that's my strategy, but that's this question. And I think that's this question that is raised by Foley in his paper. Duncan Foley, he made a paper 4 years ago about this financial and information rent, and I think that's what he has in mind. If you are not able to trace value directly, you can think about the strategy of profit that are strategy of appropriation rather than production. Yes.
You have, I think, the R&D on the very left side. I was wondering, well, first of all, how you're measuring R&D activities, what you're trying to framework, and then what is the role of, for instance, the massive subsidies that the U.S. government supplies to all of its industries, and thinking about this, what dynamic patterns.
No, you're right. That's an excellent question. So we are not. What we are looking using firm level data, we are using computed data, where we have some data about intangible and R&D spendings. So that's what we are using to build our intangible category. But that's not completely satisfying. And you're right. If you are moving more into the state subsidies, the work of Mazzucato show, for example, that it's very important. I think that you will. The result will be an even more spectacular polarization in value chains. And I think it's a very good venue. The role of the state innovation policies in global value chains, that's a very good question. I don't know work on that, but excellent question.
I have one other
Yes.
point or question, which is again about this issue of what level you observe the relationship between profit and investment. I mean, I think in some sense that's an interesting question in and of itself, because I think certain theories posit that relationship to be a macro relationship, to be an aggregate relationship, and even in the post-Keynesian literature, there seems to be some difference in that regard.
Yes.
So I think Kalecki's interesting in this regard.
Mm.
So I think asking the question of where should we observe this relationship is in itself kind of interesting when you're looking at the data. Because I think if you think about it at the aggregate level, that makes assumptions about inter-industry mobility of capital.
Yeah, I agree.
That's embedded in that, that are hard to sustain based on empirical analysis.
No, you're absolutely right. So at one level, we have profit strategies that will be at the sectoral or firm level, and that's very interesting to see how capitalists are building their strategy and reorganization of the productive sphere, and at the other level, we have growth dynamics. So that's not the same question. I think both are interesting. In one case, you are talking about the devenir of the mode of production, of the mode of regulation at some point. At the other level, you are more looking at the building of class behavior. And I think both questions are very interesting, but are not completely overlapping. You're right. And we need more in order to explain probably more clearly the relation between both of them. But yeah, I agree on that. And in fact, not only I agree, but I'm fascinated by that. That's exactly what I'm trying to make sense of. The building of strategies, the role of intangibles, a new way of capitalists are trying to build new kind of profit strategies. And what does that mean at the aggregate level in terms of trajectory? But there is no immediate relation. We need to think about that. Thank you.